Thump, thump, thump. I awoke to the sound of someone moving around downstairs and shot up quickly in my bed. I did my best to remain perfectly still as I sat with the blankets pulled up around my lap. I strained to hear if that noise jostled me from my sleep was going to continue. A few minutes passed, my body filled with an uneasy tension. I reached over to the nightstand for my phone, but quickly realized it was still sitting on the coffee table. Thump, thump, thump. The sound came once again. My dog Torgo whined from his spot on the floor and finally lifted his head. A dim moon shining through the window was the only source of light, but Torgo's eyes were reflecting at me in the dark. "How did I hear that before you?" I angrily whispered to him from my spot on the floor. "You're supposed to be my alarm system." Torgo bent his head to the side and made another little whine as if to say he was sorry. Throwing the blankets off, I grabbed my jeans from where I had left them on the floor. I had just finished buttoning them up when the sound came again. Thump, thump, thump. Torgo was now on his feet, standing next to me. I wasn't sure if he was coming along as backup or he thought that it was time for walkies. His tail wagged fast and his tongue was hanging from his mouth. Reaching down, I gave him a scratch behind his ears, and he nuzzled against my hand. "You are seriously one fierce guard dog, aren't you?" I slowly crept across the carpet towards my door, being careful to be as quiet as possible. If there was an intruder in my house, my hope was I could get the jump on them before they even realized I was awake. Torgo trotted alongside me. Despite the fact that he wasn't exactly an attack dog, I was happy for the company as my fingers wrapped around the handle of my bedroom door. As the darkness of the hallway came into view, nothing seemed to be lurking. So I slipped past the door and made my way across to the hall closet. I rummaged through in the dark, trying not to make too much noise, and wished for the first time I was into sports. A baseball bat sure would have come in handy in this situation. My options boiled down to a mop or broom, both with plastic handles, and a few spray bottles of watered-down cleaning solution. Grabbing the broom, I slowly shut the door. Torgo tilted his head at me. "Well, the linens aren't going to do much if we run into a burglar. You work with what you have," I whispered to the dog, as if he understood me and was making judgments. Thump, thump, thump. The sound came again, startling me. It seemed to be coming from the living room. Torgo suddenly seemed to perk up, his body going stiff as he started down the hallway towards the stairs. I gripped my green plastic broom with both hands and walked slowly and softly towards the source of the noise. It felt as if my heart was thundering in my chest. As I reached the top of the stairs and looked down, a sudden realization washed over me that I looked about as threatening as a kid at play. The game was Ninja Turtles, and I got to be Donatello. I steeled myself and started moving again. As I reached the third step down, I realized that Torgo had stopped following me, and I could hear him making a low growl in his throat. I turned back to see him standing fixed at the top of the stairs with his eyes laser-focused on one spot at the bottom. His mouth kept twitching, baring his teeth ever so slightly. He finally looked like something had gotten under his skin. I looked where he was looking, and my eyes had adjusted well enough to the dark that I should be able to see whatever he did. But there was nothing but shadows. Thump, thump, thump. My attention was drawn towards the living room again. As I turned, I looked to notice something small dart just inside my peripheral vision and run towards the kitchen, which was in the opposite direction of the living room. Torgo came sprinting down the stairs to give chase. He nearly knocked me over as he ran past, and I had to steady myself on the banister. He skidded when he took the last few steps in one jump and then vanished into the kitchen. I started down the rest of the steps to go after him. Now he was barking furiously. I cleared the last few steps with a jump, just like he had, but as soon as my feet touched the ground, Torgo's barks came suddenly, replaced with a mix of growls and whines. I quickly rounded the corner with my broom raised and ready to strike. "What the fuck?" I believe was my response. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw the things that had swarmed my dog. They were small, no bigger than a foot in height. They looked humanoid, but each of them had a similar spindly build. Their skin appeared to be inky black, even blacker than the room around them. 4 of them were crawling all over Torgo, biting him and digging into him with tiny claws. When I stepped forward, though, I noticed that there were even more of them lining the corners. They all turned to look at me with eyes that reflected dimly in the moonlight. Torgo let out another whine as one of them bit into his back leg. I rushed forward, kicking it off of him with my bare foot. It squealed as it slid across the linoleum and struck the cabinet beneath the sink. Another let out a screech as Torgo finally caught it in his mouth and bit down into its midsection. I started using the broom to try and knock them off of his body, but heard a hiss as a box of cereal fell from the top of the fridge and spilled its contents onto the ground. One of the things suddenly leapt down onto me from where the cereal had once sat. Its tiny claws were like needle points sinking into the skin of my cheek as I attempted to throw it off of me. Thump, thump, thump. The pounding sound continued from the living room as I finally pulled the wriggling little creature from my face. It bit into my finger as my hands wrenched down on its torso. Finally, it let out a wretched little death screech as I snapped it in half like a twig. A hideous mold smell filled the air as its putrid blood spilled down over my fingers. I felt bad for Torgo since he'd bitten one of the things in two. I could only imagine the taste. And each of us having killed one seemed to cause the others to back off. They stopped swarming Torgo and started to once again line the cabinets and fixtures, their shining eyes fixed to us as they chirped to each other and made little calls that reminded me of monkeys. Torgo went to rush forward again after them, but I grabbed him by the collar just in time and started to pull him from the kitchen back towards the bottom of the stairs. My mind was trying to come up with some kind of exit strategy, but both options seemed terrible. Option 1 was the back door, which was on the other side of the kitchen and past all the little creatures that I was currently thanking God had backed off. Option 2 was out the front door, which was through the living room, where the thumps were coming from. Thump, thump, thump. It started again, as if on cue. I turned around to face the dining room behind me and would need to go through there and then the living room to get to either my phone or the locked front door. Letting out a heavy sigh, I started to drag Torgo in that direction as I didn't feel like chancing myself against the army of tiny little monsters. It made me feel even more boxed in as I noticed the horrible little things were following us. They slowly crept through the kitchen as we backed up. Every step we moved away, one would dart forward a little too far and Torgo would snap at it with a growl. I guess you're not such a bad guard dog after all. He looked up at me with his big brown eyes and I smiled. He was a good anchor in this sudden sea of insanity. He backed into the dining room and I turned around. There didn't seem to be any of the little monsters in there at first, but then I saw a couple hiding under the table. Torgo barked at them and wrestled against the grip on his collar. The two screeched in response and scrambled past us to join the others who had now made their way to the area at the bottom of the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Come here, boy, I said quietly. As we started walking towards the living room and the source of the dreaded thump, my heart was beating so fast I could have passed for a hummingbird at that moment. Torgo had started to growl before anything was even in view, and that was anything but a good sign. When the living room finally came into view, regret hit me. My decision to try and leave by the front door had been the wrong one. The entire floor seemed to be covered in a thick, wriggling mass of darkness. Standing with its back to us, at the far end, by the door, I could see some kind of black, cloaked figure that stood at least 6 feet tall. I watched as it raised its fist up and slowly slammed it against the wall 3 times. Thump, thump, thump. On the final hit, I watched in horror as more of the little creatures suddenly started to emerge from the walls, as if they were being birthed from the shadows themselves. They fell from their place of origin and joined the writhing mass on the floor. The mass on the floor was the creatures themselves, hundreds of them. Slowly, we began to back away. My choice of direction had clearly been a mistake. Always stick with the devil you know. I pulled at Torgo's collar again, but this time, he came with little resistance. Even he knew when too much was too much. We hadn't made it a few steps when one of the things from behind us suddenly leapt onto my back, gritting my teeth in pain as it clawed into my shoulder and sunk its teeth into my neck. I gripped it by its tiny little head and spiked it into the hardwood floor of the living room. My foot came down on it, heel first, as hard as I could, and it let out the most horrendous squeal I had ever heard in my life as the life was crushed from its body. I touched at my bleeding neck, feeling the sting as blood trickled down the back of my shoulder. I looked down at Torgo, who was suddenly backing away, all on his own, his tail tucked between his legs as he did, looking up towards the living room. I realized why. Hundreds of reflective little eyes were staring at me. The sight of them nearly froze the blood in my veins. The cloaked thing standing at the other end of the living room was hanging its head back over its shoulder. Beneath the shadows of its cloak were electric blue glowing eyes in the shape of rings and a gaping maw filled with blue light. Its face was equal parts entrancing and nightmarish, luring with its bright lights like some kind of deep-sea fish. The cloaked thing let out some kind of howl that shook my bones, and suddenly, the massive creatures on the floor started moving towards me. There was no longer any choice to make as I turned around and sprinted for the back door. Torgo followed right at my side. The ones from the kitchen leapt forward as I did my best to barrel through them, ripping them off of me as they attacked. I flailed against the swarm of creatures, doing my best not to let them slow me down. At my feet, Torgo was doing the same. I finally made it to the kitchen and saw Torgo run out ahead of me, clutching one of the little monsters in his teeth and shaking it around, tearing off another that was sinking its teeth into the meat of my thigh. I ran over to knock another off of Torgo's back with a broom handle. The door was only a few feet away, and once more I grabbed Torgo's collar and moved towards it, trying to swat away each new attacker as I did. Just before we could reach open air, the back door was suddenly wreathed in shadow and my blood went cold. The cloaked thing from the living room stepped out from the new darkness and wrapped its thin, long fingers around my throat before I could react. It stared into me, with those rings of blue, its void of a mouth seemingly threatening to swallow me whole. It felt like my throat was in a vice grip. I tried to wheeze air into my lungs and prayed that I wouldn't die, staring into the endless blue hole that was the thing's mouth. The smaller creatures had once again lined the counters. They were chirping and screeching as they watched their master squeeze the life from me, and just before things went black, the cloaked creature let out a howl, and its grip around my throat loosened. Torg has sunk his teeth into the creature's hip. It reached down and grabbed the dog by the scruff of his neck, tearing him free. Torg's mouth was covered in that putrid black blood, and the cloaked creature screamed in pain as it tossed my dog into the waiting pack of screeching little creatures with him. The cloaked creature once again reached out to grab me, and I swung the broom at the thing's head in a fit of pure rage. I watched the plastic handle shatter against its skull, and those gnarled, thin fingers once again found my throat. As it started to squeeze, I heard Torgo still fighting amongst the monsters and tightened my hold on the broken, jagged plastic broom handle. I stabbed it into the cloaked creature's neon blue eye and heard it let out the worst screech yet. It backed away quickly into the shadows it had created and vanished with a parting hiss of anger and pain. I turned and saw Torgo trying to dig his way free from the mass of little creatures still covering him and attempting to drag him down. I reached in and grabbed his collar, pulling with all of my strength, feeling the things bite and tear at my arm and hands as I did. Finally, Torgo came free, and I pulled him into my arms, knocking the hangers-on back into their pile. I stumbled backwards towards the door, yanking it open as the creatures advanced towards us once again. I practically leapt through the back door and into the night. I fell hard onto the back porch, Torgo spilling from my arms. I expected the things to swarm my body as I lay there, but instead, I was suddenly awash in light. The motion sensor light on my back porch had come on. The creatures stood at the precipice of the backyard, hissing and screeching, terrified to come into the light. They backed away. And suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own. Inside, I could hear an all too familiar sound resume. Thump, thump, thump. I looked over to my right and saw a pair of reflective eyes in the shadows. It started to scramble away before I noticed it was just a raccoon hiding behind the garbage cans. I collapsed on the back porch and felt Torgo come over to me and start licking my face. I smiled as I reached up and scratched around his chin. "Good boy," I said. "Very good boy."